Hello and welcome to Comic Culture. I'm Terrence Dollard, a professor in the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke. My guest today is cartoonist Jim Keefe. Jim, welcome to Comic Culture.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Now, Jim, you are the artist on one of my favorite syndicated newspaper strips, Sally Forth. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you got involved in this strip, because it's a great strip about a family and they seem to know they're in a comic strip. So I was wondering if you could share your take on that.
Well, I don't know how far you want me to go back, because I've kind of been in syndication for a while, working on different strips, ghosting strips, this, that, and the other thing. So how I got into Sally Forth in particular, I had just moved out to Minnesota from New York. I've been working out there for a while, and I'd worked on staff at King Features Syndicate. And when I got out here, I kind of put feelers out, local cartoonists and everything. There's a school here that has a degree in comics, the Minneapolis College of Art and Design. And so there's a lot of local stuff going on here, which it's just kind of a hotbed in that respect. But as far as putting out feelers, I got in touch with a guy called Craig McIntosh, and he was the guy who was drawing Sally Forth. And because I'd worked at King Feature Syndicate, we met for lunch and we kind of just touched base with each other. And we got along pretty well. We just kind of had very similar interests, love for the art form, of course. But within the next few months, he actually got ill, where he was okay to draw a pencil, but he had trouble inking. So he reached out to me and he said, hey, listen, I don't want to, hopefully this isn't an issue, but I've seen your stuff and I know you can handle this. If I pencil it, can you do some inking of Sally Forth, kind of get me over the hump? And that's how I started doing Sally Forth. I started doing some inking for him, and he liked how it looked, and he also liked how it kind of freed him up to do some other stuff. So I started pretty regularly inking Sundays and coloring the Sundays. And because he used to FedEx stuff, I then was able to scan stuff for him and send it digitally instead of all the FedEx fees, which he was so happy with. So that's how I originally got started with the strip. I was working as an assistant to Craig McIntosh, who was a phenomenal cartoonist. And the strip started in around 1982 by Greg Howard. Greg was the writer and artist of the strip for, I'm thinking, about 10 years, until he brought Craig on board. He wanted kind of to free himself up a little himself, open up the world as far as, because he was a lawyer turned cartoonist. And he brought in a cartoonist who was like, oh, this could open up all sorts of things if, the artist can, it's like Greg had certain set pieces he had where Craig McIntosh could just draw all this other stuff, which then could be a part of the strip. So Craig McIntosh worked on the strip with Greg Howard, and then it was sold to King Features when Greg Howard left it, and that's around the time Francesco Marciuliano took it over as far as the writer. So it was Francesco and Craig for a long time, and I'm trying to get all the names right. So, and like I said, that's where I came in. And when Craig McIntosh decided he wanted to retire, within probably just a couple years of me being an assistant, he asked me if I was interested in taking over the strip, and it seemed like a good fit. The Syndicate didn't know that Craig had an assistant at the time. So he kind of presented to me to King Features and said, hey, here's this guy. He's been an assistant on the strip. I'm looking to retire. This would be a good fit. Of course, it was King's decision and Francesco's as far as if I'd be hired. So I still had to do samples and stuff. And I submitted samples. I got the green light. And in a very long way of answering your question, that's how I got set up with drawing Sally Forth. So it wasn't a case of, say, they were looking for someone and then I submitted stuff. It was a case of someone was retiring and it was just a easy fit for King Features as far as they knew I could do the work. I had done a strip before, Flash Gordon, for them, so they knew who I was. I was a known entity, and that's how I ended up getting the strip.
And one of the things I like about the strip is that there is sort of a wink to the audience that these characters are aware that they are in a comic strip, that they're aware of the certain tropes and things that go on there. And the 40th anniversary series sort of really kind of played into that, where you had, 1982 Sally coming back to try and take the place of 2022 Sally. So, I see behind you, you've got some Spider-Man stuff, you've got some other comic stuff around you. How does that sort of love of comics help you kind of tell some offbeat stories with a wink and a nod to the audience?
I think, and this is true with a lot of strips, of course, they're not your characters per se. If you're working for DC or Marvel, you're working on Spider-Man or Superman or whatever character, it may be a character you have a real fondness for, but at the same time, you have to kind of make it your own. So when Francesco took over writing Sally Forth, it was a case of, it was a strip that was created in the 80s when it was very much male-centric. So Sally Forth comes along, and here's a working woman as the lead of the strip. Now, when Francesco takes it over years later, it's a different world. Like, that isn't so novel, of course. So he has to make it his own. And I think when you say those kind of winks to the audience and such, it's taking a character that's already established and trying to find your hook into the character, finding something that will you can kind of give voice to. And the same way, like Francesco writes it, he may ask me for some suggestions here or there as far as, oh, what do you want to do this summer for like a getaway for the, characters or such. But it's the same for me. Like, he gives me the strips, and then I have to, same as him, I have to find that hook that makes it of interest to me, so that it's playful for the reader as well. Hopefully, they can see that kind of enthusiasm and that we're having fun with the strip. So I think a lot of that nodding, like that little wink to the reader, is something we appreciate in TV or movies we like, as far as that kind of comedy. So we put it in the strip.
It's really kind of fun because thinking back to that 40th anniversary, where they're kind of looking back at the way they looked or the way they acted, or how come I did this and how come I did that. It's just kind of fun for creators to look back at something and maybe see where the changes have come and kind of enjoy that. But I'm thinking about legacy strips like, let's say, Blondie. And this is something that struck me recently and kind of says why I'm so popular at parties. But I was wondering, or thinking to myself, Dagwood Bumstead is probably, in his universe, probably younger than I am at this point, and I've been reading him since I was a little kid. And I'm just thinking, he's working in middle management, he's got teenage kids. At this point, he's probably younger than I am. He's never going to get any older, but he's sort of in this world. Whereas we see in Sally Forth, we see that Ted's aware of things that have happened, and will occasionally make a comment about, well, how could that be? Because I'm only this old. Or, we get to actually see the time jump a few years ago where Hillary gets to be a few years older now in high school. So, I'm just wondering, as you and Francesco are talking, is this something that you kind of like, hey, we can kind of mix it up?
It is. Working on a comic strip is very weird in that regard, because, and I think of when you mentioned Blondie, like, it's a strip that's been around since the 30s. Like, Blondie started out as this flapper who gets married, who's dating this rich guy, and the storyline as far as him getting married, was he had to give up his wealth to marry Blondie. And that kind of stuff is, I'm sure most readers, unless they're into comic strips, have no clue about that kind of stuff. So the same with Sally Forth, where, granted, it hasn't been along the same amount of time. It's been around since the 80s. But you're working on something where any kind of reference you put into the strip that's topical, within a few years, it's not topical anymore in that same regard. And I was thinking about that as far as, we showed like Hillary in her room and she's upset about something and her mother's talking to her. And just any kind of posters I have in the room, I try to keep them, I kind of check with my daughters, like, what's the singer that's the most popular at this moment? Because if I'm putting something that was popular in the 80s, it's not going to ring true in the strip that she would have that in her room. So, but as soon as you put that in a room, you kind of date the character. Like, this is the era that character is in, but then you end up working on the character for 10, 20 years, and the character has not aged. So it's a very bizarre art form in that sense, where you want to keep things fresh, you want to change things up, but you can't, in some regards, you can't. Because they're pretty much staying the same age. Like, we did just a couple years for Hillary being older and such. There are strips, of course, where the characters do age. And in that respect, a lot of that is when the person who writes it actually has ownership of the character as well. In my case, it's work for hire. So the strip is very much owned by King Features. So we can't make those kind of changes to it, where Lynn Johnson, For Better or Worse, or other strips where the characters age, like, the writer has that ability. And even though, like, it's interesting with Charles Schultz, where he didn't age the characters per se, but you look back in the 50s to the 60s, and he actually did. Like, Lucy started out as this little baby, and then, grew to a certain age, and then it just stayed that way. And he's kind of figuring out how to work these characters and what works best. And then at the same time, at the end of his tenure, like, no one's going to take over the strip. Like, it's going to continue with movies and, even comic books or such, but the strip itself is not going to be touched, as far as anyone but him. It's just a weird medium to work in that way. And I'm sure the comic book guy, people doing comic books, it's the same way. Like, you're working on Batman, and there's only so much you can do to the character, other than it's like a story that kind of sits by itself in an alternate universe kind of thing. So, like, I do appreciate creator-owned strips and characters where the writer does have that kind of freedom to play with the character more, where there is almost more of a sense that if something happens, there's more resonance to it in a way, because we know now that's not going to change. In a comic strip, it just doesn't work that same way.
It's funny, you mentioned a couple of different things that I want to touch on, but one of them is, during the pandemic, Sally and her family, they are dealing with it. A lot of strips chose not to deal with it, but Sally does, and now we're seeing in the strips that are being published now, we're in April of 2022, geez.
It's all a blur.
It's all
These
a
last
blur.
couple of years, it's a little bit of a blur.
Ted's starting to go back to the office, and he's complaining about that, and we had recently, Hill comes to Sally and talks about how stress and anxiety is really, making it tough for her to enjoy herself, and that's a bit heavy. So you can put these heavy elements in the story, but then you also have the occasional goofy stuff where Ted is having a fantasy about, the Killing Joke when everyone's eating the ears off the Easter bunnies, the chocolate Easter bunnies. So how do you sort of come up with the right tone for a story that's kind of serious, still has to have a little bit of a joke in it, and something that's completely, maybe an homage to the Killing Joke on a Sunday strip or something? How do you kind of balance that levity and that seriousness with 3 panels?
It is a balancing act. Like, Francesco and I have talked about that, where these last few years, it was a case of, do we address mass? Do we address COVID whatsoever? I know some strips decided, we're not, which is their call, and I have no issue with it whatsoever. We decided, well, we're going to kind of dive in and to see if we can't address this in the strip. But we do talk about how Sally Forth is light drama. Like, there's things that are happening serious. A few years ago, we even had an episode where Ted's dad died. And it was something, Francesco's dad had died, I think like a year previous. And he just wanted to kind of, in a weirdly comedic way, kind of looking back, just kind of, and also light drama, but light drama, touch on that, like how that affects the characters. That balancing act, some people really appreciate it. They are very much like, oh, these are things I'm dealing with, and I'm glad it's addressed in the strip in a way that can kind of make me laugh. And with the political situation in the world, it was weird because I can draw a mask on a character in the strip, and all of a sudden I'm getting emails about how, it's a fake pandemic and why are they doing this, and COVID isn't real, and I hate this strip and I'm gonna blah, blah, blah. So there's no winning there. You just kind of have to be as true. You got to be true to the characters. It is a comic strip. You have that humorous, you want to keep it humorous. But at the same time, you almost kind of have to not worry about offending people, because it's amazing how benign I can do something or Ches can do something and people will still take offense. This past week where we mentioned Ted going back to work, we didn't mention masks. No one was wearing a mask, but I still got reader response about masks, even though it wasn't even mentioned in the strip. So no matter what, some people will be offended because it's almost like they want that anger. I don't know. But you just gotta, you don't feed the trolls, as the saying goes. You just try to be as truthful to the topic and the strip as possible.
Now, we're talking about the pandemic, and last week you emailed me and said that you had come down with COVID, and we rescheduled for this week. And I'm just wondering, you said that you were work for hire, and I'm just wondering how you kind of work that out where, you can't work maybe for a few days, but you still have to get the strip done, and how does that affect your bottom line?
Yeah, it is one of those things where I think people don't realize that with comic strips or comic books in regards to the people working on them. When you're working for Warner Brothers, DC, DC Comics, Marvel Comics, or on a comic strip where you don't own the character like Sally Forth, it's under a work for hire contract. And a work for hire contract is a way for the company to say, we own this character. So what you are producing, we own and we are the author of, which of course it does, I don't go into these contracts blind. I know what I'm signing, of course. And if I'm working on a character that's already established, it makes sense for the company to say in writing, here's what we own and this is what you are doing for us as an independent contractor. But when you're working as an independent contractor, when you're working freelance, you aren't working for the company as an employee. And what I mean by that is you don't have the health benefits, you don't have vacation pay, you don't have sick days. So when something happens like COVID or a sickness or just life happening, the deadline can get pretty stressful. And I'm speaking, I'm speaking for all freelancers in animation, cartooning. We all deal with this. It's so common. We have our little groups on Facebook or whatever where we talk about this stuff. And I know comic artists who will send a photo of themselves because something happened and they're in the hospital, and they'll send a photo of themselves in the hospital bed, just working on a deadline, where, that's the sad nature of it. It's something which every freelancer has to deal with. And actually this brings up, there's a thing called the Hero Initiative. And it's called it's at Hero Initiative. I'm going to give a plug, heroinitiative.org. And because of this situation with freelancers and where something can happen out of the blue and you can be kicked on your ass and all of a sudden you're out of a job with no money coming in. A organization like Hero Initiative steps in and helps pay some of those costs for the artist, which is just phenomenal. There's so many artists. You look at all these Marvel and DC movies being made, and for the most part, the creators, when you see that credit line at the end of a movie where, after the 10 minutes of everyone working on the movie, there'll be a credit line with some of the artists who created the characters you actually saw. That credit line doesn't mean they're getting paid. That just means that they are being acknowledged for working on that character, or in some cases, having created that character. There are a few artists, Jack Kirby, who created much of the Marvel Universe, Siegel and Schuster, who created Superman. After much litigation and lawyers, were able to get something out of the company for all the work they had done. But there's so many nameless people who have created all these characters which people love and are in these movies that make millions and billions of dollars, but they're kind of forgotten other than a credit line. And it's a case like that where something like the Hero Initiative is really important because it kind of steps up for those artists, which I can't say enough for.
And it is, we hear about artists who created some great characters, great comics, and towards the end of their lives, they're destitute. And it's great that there's an organization that can help them. And I hope that the folks watching, if they're interested, they'll go to the website and perhaps make a donation if they've enjoyed the characters over the years. Now, I see we have about 3 or so minutes left in our conversation. I wanted to talk a little bit about, I know, time flies when you're having fun. But I wanted to talk a little bit about the tools that you use, because I think recently you posted a picture on Facebook that you have dip pens and brushes that you use when you're working on Sally Forth. So yes. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the way you actually do the art.
Well, and I do use the computer. I do have a Wacom tablet. I used to when I was working on Flash Gordon, I used to hand letter everything. Now it's done digitally. There are certain strips which will be mostly digital because it'll involve whatever. But I just, as much as possible, I like to keep the dip pen. I love using the brush. Just that, what is the word? Tactile, just that pen to paper, I've always loved. I love the look of an ink line, and there's something about working on the computer, and I'm not down, like there are phenomenal digital artists out there. For me, I get the joy out of using pen and ink. So I can still use it, work on the strip, scan the art in afterwards, do touch-ups, lettering, coloring is all done digitally, but it still gives me so much enjoyment to use pen and ink and to use a brush. I love using a brush. I have ever since I was introduced to them way back at the Kubert School back in the day when I first started learning about this stuff. So it's the love of the craft which really has me still doing pen and ink. I enjoyed, like there's an aspect of digital I enjoy, and it speeds up certain production aspects of the strip. But for me, I'll always, whenever possible, I'll be using dip pen and brush.
There's something special about just holding the finished piece in your hand. You can't walk around with a tablet because at some point it runs out of batteries, or you pull it out of the wall.
Well, and if you see, I have a couple artist editions behind me. One of them, which reproduce artwork so it looks like the original. And I remember I was able to see some of Bernie Wrightson's originals for Frankenstein. And that kind of work is just, I have a love for that. It is just so beautiful. So I can't say enough. That's the art form for me, is that pen and ink on paper.
It is amazing whenever I get a chance to go to a con and there's an art dealer there who has original pages. Just looking at the line work of like a Joe Sinnott or a Dick Giordano over someone's pencils, it's magical to see that actual line on the page. But unfortunately, they're telling us that we are out of time. So Jim, I'd like to thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule to talk with me today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated it. Hopefully I haven't rambled on too long here and there, but that's the purpose of an interview, so I guess that's okay.
Absolutely, and I'd like to thank everyone at home for watching Comic Culture. We will see you again soon. Comic Culture is a production of the Department of Mass Communication at the University of North Carolina at Pembroke.